I have two readings for you today. The first is from the Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. To save a man, and thereby to spare a father's agony and a mother's feelings, is not to do a noble deed. It is but an act of humanity. The second is from the book of Matthew, chapter 5, verses 23 through 24. So when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. How many of you have read The Count of Monte Cristo? Neither have I. No, I'm kidding. But seriously, the movie was fantastic. Before I became a minister, I used to hold this story in my mind as the penultimate example of injustice. And my how sweet Edmond Dante's revenge felt for a while. If you remember, Edmond was imprisoned falsely. The Count of Monte Cristo was a massive success, both in Dumas' time and in ourselves, and in our time. It was considered the most popular book in Europe when released, and it went on to be translated onto the screen a staggering 40 times. While the writing itself is excellent, I think much of the book's success can be accredited to the way it so effectively taps into the universal human experience of injustice, highlighting the way people, helpfully and unhelpfully, react to it. For some, like Edmond Dantes, injustice breeds rage, a deep, brooding fire burning in their bellies that can only be satisfied by revenge. For others, their response can vary between sorrow, apathy, a deeper sense of faithfulness or faithlessness, and an unwavering determination to right a wrong. And for others, maybe they engage in a balancing act between all 5 of these reactions. Personally, I see nothing wrong with experiencing any of these emotions. Sometimes rage is the appropriate answer to injustice, and the fire it creates can fuel necessary action. At other times, it is quiet determination which should have the spotlight. No one was more aware of this than Martin Luther King Jr., who made it his life's work to understand how to overturn injustice and dismantle controlling systems of oppression, using both quiet determination and fiery action. One of the most powerful legacies of MLK, one that served his purpose well, is his reminder that spirituality and activism are 2 halves of one tree. Many of the civil rights organizers, like the abolitionist organizers before them, met in churches. This is for several reasons. The first and most obvious is because church was one of the only places where people of color could gather in large groups without gaining suspicion of police. But it was also because Americans had used faith to justify their racism for centuries. And King and others were wise enough to understand that the only way to combat this type of ignorant religious certainty, as I'll call it, was to speak religious language, use religious rituals, and call upon the same religious scriptures to paint an alternative picture of race relations for their oppressors. And lastly, these meetings were held in churches because King and the many, many women and men who are responsible for the civil rights movement knew that without their faith, which had carried them through so much pain, indignity, and suffering already, they would be unable to continue down the long path towards liberation that was required of them. Faith, as Professor Paul Harvey described it, gave ordinary people ground down by racism and exploitation the spiritual sustenance to stand up and, in some cases, to lay their lives on the line. Because of these reasons, King knew that activism, without the force or conviction of spirituality, is often ineffective. And when I speak of spirituality, I don't mean it in a narrow sense. I mean it in the much broader understanding of the word. A tapping into something bigger than yourself, whether it's justice, love, goodness, duty, these transcendent themes that help to raise us to our greater selves. A belief that this is possible and working towards it, this is the spirituality that I refer to. King said, "Science gives man knowledge, which is power. Religion gives man wisdom, which is control. Science deals mainly with facts, and religion deals mainly with values. So to leave wisdom and values out of a moral fight like civil rights and racism would be simply self-defeating." And likewise, faith without the commitment to manifest it is hollow. A frequent criticism of mysticism and certain other forms of religion, such as Buddhism, is that while it can be personally, spiritually fulfilling, it has a history and really a core theme of disengagement from the here and now. It is individualistic in the worst sense, a sort of theology of navel-gazing, if you will. And I'll do me and you do me, you do you mantra, which leads to a world rife with injustice. Dr. Stephen Taylor, a psychology professor, writes, "Some spiritual traditions do have traditions of otherworldliness and detachment, most obviously the monastic traditions of Buddhism, Hinduism, and Christianity. Some spiritual traditions and teachers also maintain that the world is an illusion, and so cultivate an indifference to pain and suffering." In other words, these traditions are asking, why should we be concerned with suffering when it's fundamentally unreal? Or from a slightly different perspective, some teachings hold that although the world may be real in itself, its seeming difficulties are unreal. The world exists in a state of perfection, so how could problems exist? Such attitudes certainly promote a detachment from the world and an indifference to social or global problems. I've heard in those communities say that I've heard in our community, and I mean that in a larger sense, that they aren't interested in the social justice component of our faith and would rather focus purely on the spirituality of it. And while I have always felt that people are free to come and take what they need from our time together, it is difficult to understand what spirituality means separate from the action required for social justice initiatives, particularly in our association. What is spirituality if it does not have a component of action? Our entire faith was built upon recognizing and addressing the social, spiritual, and moral ills of the world, and then from there, working together to try and combat them. Unitarians and Universalists had both been individually working for what they considered the biggest injustices of their time: the need for prison reform, ending slavery, women's rights, and many, many more. But when the two faiths merged and became the UUA, the Unitarian Universalist Association, in 1961, their commitment to activism became even stronger. When we formed the UUA, we were bringing a new identity to a very old faith, a spectacularly difficult feat, if you ask me. Inviting people in from backgrounds and faith traditions up from all over, we chose a commitment to social justice as our common language. When we couldn't agree on whether or not there was a god or goddesses, what they might be called, and to what extent they might be active in our daily lives, we disagreed on all of this, but we did so while standing firmly on the ground, the shared ground of action. The first issue this newly formed association took on was, of course, the civil rights, eventually marching with MLK Jr. on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and of course we know losing a minister and a congregant. King considered us as UUs great co-conspirators for the cause, which I think we should hold up honorably. And in turn modeled for us the infusion of these two parts of our being, the heart and the feet. And though there is a strong history and theology of otherworldliness and disengagement in religion, King's life and legacy proved yet again that those who have effectively combined both spirituality and activism have created the most important social changes in humanity's history. And Dr. Taylor supports this, saying, "In my research into spiritual awakening, I have consistently found that awakened individuals tend to become more altruistic and often become more engaged and active. When people undergo spiritual development or fully fledged spiritual awakening, they develop a strong sense of compassion as their self-boundaries become stronger, meaning they stop identifying as me versus you and begin to think of us. They develop a strong sense of compassion as their self-boundaries become softer. They develop a wide perspective, a universal outlook. Rather than being immersed in a narrow world of personal problems and concerns, how am I going to pay my bills? How am I going to get childcare for tomorrow? And they become more invested in all-encompassing and unconditional type of morality. They don't practice moral exclusion, but extend their benevolence to all human beings indiscriminately. Now remember, he is talking about fully spiritually awakened folks. Not every Billy and Bobby Sue down the street who wave their Confederate flag right next to their cross. Okay? For awakened individuals, justice and fairness are universal principles which transcend laws or conventions. They may even be willing to break laws if necessary, and even to potentially sacrifice their own well-being in order to uphold moral principles. This is why throughout history, many of the world's great idealists and social reformers were spiritually developed individuals. Think of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Gandhi, Jesus, Martin Luther King, and Nelson Mandela. As a result of these characteristics, spiritually developed people feel a strong impulse to help alleviate other people's suffering or to help them to fulfill their own potential. They feel a strong idealistic desire to change the world for the better, an impulse to serve other people, and to contribute to the human race in some way. Again, I'm not suggesting that an atheist couldn't have an overwhelming desire to contribute to the human race or change the world for the better. I would never suggest such a thing. But atheists, knowing that there are some in this room, whether they all agree on the term or not, would likely express faith in transcendental truths worth working for. The same transcendental truths I named as spiritual are equality, justice, love, etc. So how do we reconcile the two? How do we model spiritual activism in the way that those inspiring individuals that I just mentioned did? There is such a movement, believe it or not, called spiritual activism. How appropriate, right? And I'd like to share a few of their tenets. Okay? They are instructional and inspirational, and I think they fit neatly into the values of our Unitarian Universalist faith. The first is all action is based on compassion. When championing a cause, the mindset must be altruistic, and the motivating emotion must be positive. Spiritual activism is action for the benefit of something, not against something. Okay? This is where Edmond Dantes went off the tracks. He was motivated by revenge, and it was this blind rage that he eventually ended up regretting. Compassion, this is number 2, compassion flows from the understanding of the connection between all living beings. We are all connected through our shared humanity. When you learn to see that our differences are sometimes superficial and our similarities manifest, sympathy, or worse, pity, gives way to compassion. Our actions shift from one of us helping them to one of for the good of all. We become one, in other words. The third is compassion must be applied with wisdom. There are more causes that exist than an individual or group can possibly be involved with. It is important to choose your causes carefully. Learn and act instead of react. Number 4, apply, my favorite meeting word, synergy, and teamwork to accomplish goals. Synergy is the process where 2 or more actions combine to produce an effect greater than the sum of its individual parts. For instance, if you, Sylvia, were to donate to a cause that you really felt strongly about, it would make a difference. If we were to donate to a cause that we felt strongly about, it would make even more of a difference. Like ripples in a pond, spiritual actions combine and build on each other to magnify an effect beyond what each could do individually. So whenever possible, team up with others to acquire a multifaceted and more holistic approach to spiritual activism. 5, spiritual activism is the pursuit of service for the good of all, not the advancement or benefit of individuals or selected communities. So be mindful that ego and self-service have no place in spiritual activism. 6, pursue integrity, honesty, and dignity in the conduct of your actions. I think that speaks for itself. But it essentially means it does not mean the ends justify the means. Do not defame your detractors or those who doubt you. This one is really hard, right? A confrontational approach leads to a defensive reaction. We know that time and time again when we go out and say, "How dare you? Don't call me that because you're that." It's not going to get you anywhere. Approach others with openness and compassion in your heart. Build on the commonalities between you instead of focusing on the differences. As much as possible, detach yourself from the results of your actions and aspire to always be a peacemaker. And there are some limitations to that. I just want to put that caveat in there. 8, raising another up raises you up as well. This is just all around good advice. Helping another becomes a form of self-love as well as an expression of outward love. This becomes an upwardly spiraling cycle of increasing awareness, connection, compassion, involvement, capacity, and back to increasing awareness. Number 9, learn to listen to your heart and not your mind. Your mind may only see the problem. Your heart will always feel the solution. Learn to act with faith and cultivate a loving perception when facing collective problems. And the last one, search out viable and sustainable solutions. So seek out solutions that maintain or restores the dignity of individual humans and their community. Solutions that become self-sustaining. So these 10 tenets, which are a lot, you can email me them or your information and I can get them back to you so you can look at them. They're not perfect and perhaps a bit idealistic, but they're a good starting point for identifying how you connect both halves to your whole. We are battered daily with news of the work that must be done to heal our world. It's exhausting to have your heart pulled in a million directions every 30 minutes, every time there's a new headline, feeling about how best you can make changes for the positive. Eventually, you may desire to detach, to seek shelter in your own navel-gazing theology, hopeful that someone else who is smarter, stronger, and with more energy than you will take your place in the fight. Don't. Stay the course. Replant your roots in the ground of your faith, however you might define that faith to be. Dig deep into the rich soil around you with those who have gone before you. Let their journey inspire you. Let it fill up your tank so you know you're not alone. New Thought spiritual teacher Ernest Holmes said, "All of the power of the universe is with you. Feel it, know it, and then act as though it were true. It must be true. This world, this faith, this community, we are counting on it to be true, and we are counting on you."